All right. Hi, folks. So right out the gate, I'm going to ask you for something. I'm going to ask you to remember a set of numbers. Now, it's not going to make any sense right now, and that's okay. It doesn't have to. I just want you to recall them. And it is kind of important. So the numbers are 1, 2, and 3. Do not write them down. Only use your minds to remember them. All right, onward. So I want to talk to you about gender. But before we just jump right in, it's important for us to have a shared understanding of a few things. And one of those things is the differences between the way the words sex and gender are used. So in the US, when we talk about sex, we're using that word to describe the biological sex someone is assigned at birth. Now you might think that's a weird way to say that, assigned at birth, but it's actually exactly what we do. When a child is born, the physician in the room visually assesses genitalia and assigns sex, male or female. When we're talking about gender, we're including both gender identity, which is how someone experiences their gender, and gender expression, which is how someone presents their gender. So historically, sex has been discussed from more of a biological perspective and gender from more of a social or cultural perspective. Right. So, like in the US, we have certain behaviors, characteristics that are described as more masculine or more feminine. Right. So, think the person grilling versus the person setting the table. So, for some people, these two things match. The sex they're assigned at birth aligns with how they experience and express their gender. That is what it means to be cisgender. But for many other people, there's varying degrees of incongruence between the sex they're assigned at birth and their gender identity and expression. So for some, the sex they're assigned at birth aligns with how they experience their gender, but not necessarily how they present their gender. And for other people, there's an even greater degree of incongruence between the sex they're assigned at birth and their gender identity. That's what it means to be transgender. And there are even many more experiences in between. I know it's complicated. And this is just the opener. So you're welcome. Needless to say, before we go any further, one thing I want to make sure I teach you in this talk is how to get out of quicksand. Now, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but quicksand is actually a huge problem here in Chicago. In fact, I nearly fell in some right before this talk. And when you fall into quicksand, the normal, natural thing to do is to fight and struggle against that quicksand. But what do we know about that approach? Sinks you faster. The way out of quicksand is actually pretty counterintuitive, which is why I'm going to teach it to you in the event that you find yourself in quicksand. You actually make a giant starfish with your body, you lean back, you make as much contact with the surface area of that quicksand as possible, which will allow your body to rise to the surface, and then you roll out. Wild though, right? But the way out of quicksand is actually to make more contact with the quicksand. And at this point, you might be thinking, oh, why are you talking to us about quicksand? I thought this talk was on gender. And it is. But along this journey together, you might find yourself pulled into some quicksandy traps of discomfort. And if that happens, I just want you to remember your training, that even if you feel pulled to fight and struggle against that discomfort, that quicksand, see if you can just lean in. Dare I say, make more contact with that discomfort. Which brings us to our first potential quicksand trap. Sex is not as simple as we've been taught. Much of what we've been told, much of the messaging that is out there, is that there are two distinct and permanent sexes. Male, born with XY chromosomes, a penis and testes, and female, born with XX chromosomes, a vagina and ovaries. What if I told you that about 2% of fish, or 500 species of fish, actually have the ability to change their sex? That for many fish, sex is not static. Given any set of environmental needs or factors, many fish can change sex, often from female to male, and some can even change back. So you might be thinking, yeah, but we aren't fish. Fair. So let's talk mammals. Some mammals, like the female elephant and the female spotted hyena, have anatomy that is actually indiscernible from their male counterparts when not aroused. This anatomy is called the penile clitoris, which is basically an enlarged clitoris that mirrors a penis. This mirroring can be in aesthetics, but it can also be in function. So the female spotted hyena, for example, urinates, engages in sex, and gives birth through the penile clitoris. I know. You don't even have to tell me you also aren't elephants or hyenas. So what if I told you that out of the 140 million babies born last year, at least 280,000 of them were born with genitalia that couldn't be clearly and easily classified as either penis or labia? You might say, well, it's a pretty rare statistic there, Court. Fine. If we expand that to include differences of sexual development beyond just ambiguous genitalia, including atypical chromosomes, atypical hormones, atypical gonads, research proposes that range is actually 0.5% to 1.7% of births. That's the equivalent of redheads born in the world. And this sex binary makes things really difficult. So take Maria Jose Martinez Patino, for example. She was assigned female at birth and was born with a DSD, which she didn't find out about until later in life when she attempted to compete in the 1985 Olympics. They had her blood tested and found that she actually had XY chromosomes and later discovered undescended testes. But her body was actually resistant to the testosterone produced by the undescended testes. So her overall level of testosterone was actually lower than individuals assigned female at birth without a DSD. She wasn't allowed to compete in the 1985 Olympics nonetheless. All right. That's chromosomes, that's anatomy, but surely we can see differences in the brain. I know. It's tough. That messaging about sex differences is just so deeply rooted. But in reality, our brains are no more sexed or gendered than our livers. Recent review of existing research shows that all differences attributed to sex in the brain account for less than 1% of differences when you take into consideration the size of the brain. And globally, male brains are larger than female brains. But this aligns with general physiological differences between male bodies and female bodies. So it's true for other organs as well. The liver, the kidneys, the pancreas, all larger in male bodies. And in fact, the size differences for those organs is larger than the size differences for the brain. Which brings us to our next potential quicksand trap. If sex isn't so simple, where do we even begin with gender? And it's tough, because what we've been told about sex forms the foundation for how we interpret and perceive gender. So if we've been taught about sex as a binary of male and female, it sets us up to expect and believe that gender will follow. And as humans, we are far more likely to pay attention to information that confirms an existing belief system. And then we use that as information or evidence to further that belief system. Biomedical sciences, including genetics, endocrinology, neuroanatomy, holds that gender identity and expression, quote, likely reflects the complex interplay between biological, cultural, and environmental factors, end quote. It's just not as simple as one or the other. In fact, they're using the word mosaic to describe this. Take me, for example. I was assigned female at birth, but I do not experience my gender to be female. I also don't experience it to be exclusively male. And my presentation leans masculine, right? And it's difficult. Binary thinking is something that's biased in our minds, right? As humans, we have a predisposition to like things to nicely fit into their categories. It allows us to predict what will happen and know how to respond, right? So think in basic survival terms for a second. You come across a saber-toothed tiger. Safe or dangerous? Is dangerous. Now run. It's exceptionally helpful, right? But what about cars? Safe or dangerous? Yes? Some could argue there have been tons of advances in car safety, everything from airbags to smart car detection of unwanted lane shifts, and in 2021, there were 42,915 deaths related to car accidents. It's just not as simple as the binary suggests. So now what? Well, now it's time for our trickiest quicksand trap of them all, discomfort. As we start to question what we've been taught, what we've learned, all this old programming, it can bring up a lot of confusion and uncertainty. Two things our minds do not love, right? Can make us really uncomfortable. And when we feel that discomfort, it can make us want to revert back to what I've always done or what I've always known, right? But this is the struggle to get out of discomfort. Remember your training, lean in. Sometimes confusion is just an indicator that we're loosening our grip on the old, even if we don't quite know what the new is yet. And there's great news. As humans, we have an amazing capacity to learn, right? So what were those numbers I told you to remember that you absolutely aren't looking at anything because you didn't write them down, you're only using your minds to recall? That's right. 1, 2, 3. Amazing job. Well done. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to forget them. Just get rid of them. Just wipe them out. You can't. And even if you were like, yes, I can. And I said, okay, well, what were the numbers? And you're like 7, 8, and 9. What you first have to do is remind yourself of what numbers not to say, 1, 2, and 3, which is remembering. And that's just it. As humans, we are not reductive learners, right? So in other words, you can't get rid of something you've previously learned, but you can build new pathways of information and knowing, right? So finish the sentence. Mary had a little, I'm sure I didn't even have to get to had, and your mind was like, lamb, I know this one. It's lamb, they're not getting me on this. And you're right, it is lamb. So again, well done. But how many times do you think you heard that, saying that, read that? Countless times, right? Now let's say you want Mary to have a hamster. How many times do you think you'd have to practice Mary had a little hamster in order to get hamster to show up when I ask that question? So many times. And even still, lamb will likely show up. So when you've known someone in the context of she, her for years, and then they share with you that their pronouns are they, them, we're not just going to be able to wipe out all that old learning, right? It's still going to show up. And we're going to have to practice, hear me when I say this, practice they, them, just like we would have to practice hamster. And you will make mistakes because when you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, when you're stressed out, that old stuff shows up and we fall back on old learning. It's just part of being human. And it's difficult to expand to make room for new. As humans, we are most comfortable with what we're most familiar with. And what we're most familiar with is lamb. So when we struggle to get out of that discomfort that shows up, we tend to revert back to that old learning, right? What I've always done. So you just think about making a mistake and you feel anxious and embarrassed and overwhelmed or any other uncomfortable emotion, and then you don't even try, right? But this is where that training comes in so handy, right? See, aren't you glad I taught you how to get out of quicksand? Lean in, be uncomfortable, and then say they. And it's really hard, right? We all fall into quicksand. I'm standing up here giving this talk on gender, on how to get out of quicksand, and I will be the first one to tell you it's incredibly difficult, right? I recently joined a gym and I was really excited about this gym. And so I go in there for my first workout, crushing it, and someone yells out, "Go, Courtney, this is her first workout." I was like, so kind, so supportive, and so assumptive. And I fell right into the quicksand. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to embarrass the person by correcting them. I didn't want to feel embarrassed. I didn't want to feel that weird energy shift where someone says something really nice to you, and then in response, you correct them, and then they feel badly. I didn't want any of it. So I said nothing. I just felt less excited and less comfortable in that space. Then the next time I was in there, my incredible wife set me up in the most wonderful way. She said, yeah, is there a place where you can indicate pronouns either in the app or here at the gym? All I had to say was something like, that'd be great, because I use they, them. Instead, I fell right back into that quicksand. And I can't tell you how frustrated I was, how mad I was at me, but that's just it. That is the quicksand. That when we struggle to get out of that discomfort and then judge myself and talk rather unkindly to myself, the further and quicker I sink. So how can I take a breath, starfish into that discomfort, and simply say, they? So here's the challenge for all of us, right? If the binary is not as real as we've been taught, and if it's time for us to rethink the hypothesis on gender, do the counterintuitive thing. Pause when that discomfort shows up. Lean in. Loosen your grip on what you've always done and what you've always known. Take a breath and simply ask, what pronouns do you use?